Of all the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Oh, yay, oh, yay, oh, yay.
I'm Carolyn Shapiro, Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Institute on the Supreme Court of the United States at IIT Chicago-Kent College of Law. I'm here with my colleague, Professor Sheldon Nahmad, to talk about the Affordable Care Act case on the decision that came down just a few days ago. So, Shel, could you just quickly summarize what the bottom line holdings were, and then we'll go back and talk about them in more detail.
First, the individual mandate was upheld. Secondly, for the most part, the Medicaid expansion was upheld as well.
So the individual mandate is the part of the statute that requires people who can afford it to have health coverage, or alternatively, if they don't choose to buy health insurance, they have to pay a penalty. And the big fight about this had to do with whether Congress had the power to impose that kind of requirement under the Commerce Clause. Right. Can you just quickly explain why do we even talk about whether Congress has the power to do something?
We talk about that because this government is one of enumerated powers, and Congress has to act pursuant to a particular enumerated power. It could be the Commerce Clause, it could be taxing, it could be spending. And most of the attention was focused, in fact, on the commerce power because that's the natural fit for something that regulates an economic activity.
But in fact, as it turns out, the Supreme Court, or 5 of the justices on the Supreme Court, found that the Affordable Care Act mandate is not supported by the commerce power.
Well, that's right. Justice Roberts and 4 of the dissenters, the so-called conservatives, all agreed that the commerce power didn't work here, but 5 justices, Justice Roberts and 4 other justices, the so-called liberals, really moderates, agreed that the taxing power did sustain the constitutionality of the individual mandate.
What is the taxing power?
The taxing power, which we all know, especially around April 15th, really year-round, is that Congress has power to tax individuals.
And so that's the basis on which the Chief Justice, who was the only one of the conservatives to find that the mandate was constitutional, that's the basis on which he rested his conclusion.
Correct.
So do we know what that means going forward for the scope of Congress's commerce power?
Well, it's very interesting because technically speaking, Chief Justice Roberts did not have to say anything about the commerce power since the court had sustained the constitutionality of the individual mandate on the basis of the taxing power. So technically, as lawyers would say, it's dictum. What that means is it's not really the law, quote unquote, but when 5 justices of the Supreme Court agree that this could not be sustained under the commerce power, it has a lot of force. It's pretty much a shot across the bow. Congress now knows what its limits are, and the American people now have a good sense of what the limits of the commerce power are, so long as these 5 justices are around at least.
And the limit is, the line that they drew was inactivity.
Correct.
That Congress can't regulate inactivity, can't force people into the marketplace.
Correct.
Now, all 5 of them basically agreed to that.
Correct.
To that rationale.
A rather formal approach, because pretty clearly the failure to buy health care insurance has an economic effect. But nevertheless, they drew the line between activity, commercial activity, and commercial inactivity.
And the 4 more moderate justices, led by Justice Ginsburg, would have upheld the mandate.
Correct.
Under the Commerce Clause.
Yes.
So was this a surprise, this outcome?
Some of us predicted this outcome, but I don't know of anybody who predicted the outcome based on the taxing power. I know I did not. I thought it would be 5-4. Didn't know who the 5th so-called conservative justice would be.
5-4 to uphold the mandate.
5-4 to uphold the mandate, that's correct. The taxing power surprised me. The government, fortunately, for those who think that the individual mandate is wise and constitutional, the government made the argument. It got little or no play, as we all know, in the mass media.
And when you say you predicted the outcome, are you surprised that it's Chief Justice Roberts who turns out to have been the swing vote?
Well, I had thought that it could possibly be Justice Scalia because he had joined the majority opinion in the medical marijuana case, the race case, some years ago. I never did think it would be Justice Kennedy because on federalism issues, you know, the F word that we really haven't talked about yet, on federalism issues, he's moved very much to the conservative side.
And maybe you could say a word or two about what federalism is and why this case implicates federalism at all.
The case implicates federalism because when Congress acts constitutionally, it effectively disables the states very often from acting in the same area. And even if it doesn't disable the states from acting in the same area, it surely disables the states from acting in any manner inconsistent with what Congress has done. And therefore, these kinds of issues, commerce power, taxing power, spending power, other powers, implicate federalism. That is the role of the states. May I say something about a little understood aspect of federalism?
Absolutely.
Why many of the justices feel so strongly about it. Even though individual rights are often protected by the Bill of Rights and equal protection and due process, nevertheless, the framers thought that the states had to serve as a buffer, if you will, against the tyranny of the national government to protect individuals from the national government. So it's a kind of structural argument, to use a fancy word, which in the view of many people federalism protects individual rights and not just states' rights.
It protects individual rights by having this other level of sovereignty or other level of government that is accountable to the people through a completely different mechanism.
Correct, and also political accountability, you're right, is one factor, and also allows the states, if you will, to step in between the individuals and the federal government.
So let's talk about the other aspect of the opinion, which the other aspect of the case, which does also directly implicate federalism. This had to do with the Medicaid expansion, which requires states to provide Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor, to people up to 133% of the poverty line who are under 65. This is a pretty major expansion.
Major indeed.
It covers single people who haven't previously been covered by Medicaid. And the Supreme Court upheld this requirement, but sort of limited the federal government's ability to impose conditions on the state. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. It's been long understood that the spending power is an independent power of Congress, which can be exercised for the general welfare. It's pretty broad. It's not connected to any of the enumerated powers that we were talking about earlier. So the question is, when does Congress exceed its power under the spending power and thereby implicate federalism in an adverse way? Well, the Supreme Court held in this case that because the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act punished, if you will, the states who did not agree to the expansion of Medicaid, the significant expansion that you talked about, if you will, sanction them, punish them by removing all Medicaid funding. Threatening to remove all Medicaid funding altogether. And that 7 justices, interestingly enough, not only Justice Roberts and the 4 conservative justices, but Justice Breyer and Justice Kagan agreed with that this was, to paraphrase, if I remember what Chief Justice Roberts said, it's like a gun held to the head of the states. And that was too much under the spending power.
So the risk of losing all of their Medicaid funding, which is a significant portion of state budgets, was too coercive.
Yes, I think, if I remember the figure correctly, on an average was 10% of the typical state's funding.
I think it could be even closer to 20%.
Well, significant.
It's a pretty major portion of state budget, and of course Medicaid is a cooperative federal-state program. Some of the money comes from the federal government, some of the money comes from the states, and the states, generally speaking, have to, if they want the federal money, have to run the program according to the federal government's
criteria. Right.
That basic structure isn't changed.
Correct.
Right. What's changed is this imposition of the requirement that states expand their Medicaid program at the risk, or if not, risk losing all of their Medicaid.
And what's also interesting about that, even though Chief Justice Roberts referred to this as a gun to the head, I think until 2016, for states that opt in, the federal government was paying 100%, and thereafter it was 90% of the expansion. But yet the Supreme Court, 7 justices thought this went too far.
So a state could opt in to this to this expansion and not actually have to spend any more money of its own from its own budget.
For the foreseeable future, for the short term.
At least in the short term.
Right.
But as Chief Justice Roberts pointed out, of course, Congress could change that formula at some point in the future.
Yes, it could.
So this actually creates kind of an interesting political moment where some Republican governors are actually threatening not to take what is essentially free money from the federal government because they don't have to.
That's exactly correct, but you know, it's probably appropriate because what the individual mandate and Medicaid expansion decisions basically said was that this is for the political process. The political process is spoken, and now let's leave it up to the individual states to decide whether to opt in or not. And that's appropriate, it seems to me.
Opt into the Medicaid expansion,
Yes.
but the rest of the law, they don't
Stands.
have. The rest of the law stands.
Correct.
So an individual state, for example, could choose not to set up these insurance exchanges through which people can purchase health insurance that they need to purchase under the mandate. And that's something they can opt out of, but if they don't do it, the federal government will do it for them.
Correct. That's under the statute itself. States that don't choose to do create these exchanges.
So it's been a pretty fascinating few days. As
To understate it considerably.
And one of the interesting things, as we talked about already, is that there isn't really a clear majority opinion at all. The Chief Justice's opinion is, for the most part, for himself alone, and then the 4 more moderate justices, moderate liberal justices, all join one opinion. So do you anticipate in the future that there will be fights about what precisely the holding of this case is?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, technically this is dictum. The individual mandate Commerce Clause discussion did not have to be addressed, but it's powerful. Well, I like to say a word, if I may, about Chief Justice Roberts, who's been getting excoriated in some circles because of his opinion on the individual mandate in particular. There probably is an element of statesmanship there, but I also think that he honestly believed that the statute, the individual mandate, was sustainable as a tax. I'm not going to suggest that it was all political in that respect at all. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on this thing. So I think he reached a sound decision. Now, my own view was that this was an easy case under the Commerce Clause, but
for upholding the mandate.
But 5 justices disagreed with me. So who am I to disagree with 5 justices of the Supreme Court?
Chief Justice Roberts might have been considering statesmanship. What's the argument there that statesmanship plays a role?
Well, the argument there goes back, if you will, to Bush v. Gore, where the Supreme Court, as we all remember, in a bitterly contested decision, effectively, according to some at least, elected George Bush president of the United States.
Certainly stopped the vote counting in Florida.
That's correct. 5-4 decision, as we know. And then things weren't helped, and that's political partisan. That's a political partisan attack.
On the court.
On the court. And then you had the Citizens United case a few years ago, which got a lot of people upset in terms of saying that there was no constitutional limit, no free speech limits on the corporate expenditures in connection with campaigns and the like. And now you had this one. I think Chief Justice Roberts was sensitive to all of that. Again, I don't think that was the driving consideration for him. Was it a factor in his decision? Probably.
The concern would be that people see the court as a purely political actor.
That's correct.
And if justices vote in ways that are not necessarily consistent with what we'd predict politically, then that suggests that there's something else going on.
That's right. It was interesting when I read this very lengthy opinion of his, which is, I think, 59 pages. Yes. He said at the outset that the wisdom of legislation is not for the Supreme Court. The constitutionality of legislation is only for the Supreme Court. And I wish that the media had remembered a little bit more of that in the months leading up to this decision.
It's really not, the court is not speaking on whether or not it thinks the Affordable Care Act is a good idea or not. There's sort of a sense that Chief Justice Roberts might not think it's such a good idea,
Correct.
but nonetheless thinks it's constitutional.
Which is a good example, if that's the case, and I suspect it is, of judicial restraint.
Upholding something that you think is not
Is
necessarily
wrong,
good
is
policy.
not wise.
Shel, thank you so much for
My
talking with
pleasure.
me about it. I look forward to talking to you again.
I'm sure we will.